Sarah is a senior palliative care chaplain at Mass General Hospital, serves on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School Center for Palliative Care, is a member of the St. Mary Antiochian Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Massachusetts. Father John always corrects my Massachusetts city spellings and state spellings. She attended Harvard Divinity School and St. Vlad's Seminary. Her recent book, Memory Eternal, Living with Grief as Orthodox Christians, came out of her doctoral research and was published last year by Ancient Faith and is available for purchase for the low price of $15, which is a conference discount. Personally, also Sarah is the secretary, right?
Yes.
Of the OCAMPR board, and so I have the privilege of serving with her on that board. And I also had the privilege of reading her book and actually facilitating the bereavement sessions that are described in the appendix, and found it to be a wonderful resource to support those that are grieving in our local communities. And I will not steal your thunder by talking about it, but I thought it's a wonderful addition to our toolkit, and we're going to hear Sarah talk about that today. Welcome, Sarah.
Is this doing something, like a microphone-wise?
It doesn't seem like
I'm
it
just going
is.
to take it off. Because the mouse
And
might
there
come
might
back.
be a mouse in the room, we're not sure.
There may be a mouse, but if so, we're just going to...
The
All
power's
God's
through.
creatures got a place in the choir. So, hi, thank you for being here. So this is interesting because I want to kind of share about the book, and some of you have already read it and are using it, and some people want to learn about it for the first time. So some of this may be a little redundant, so forgive me, but I think it's always helpful to revisit kind of what we think about grief as a church anyways. So with that, I want to start with a quote that is in my book, but I did not originate the quote. Today we will let God love us fully in our grief. A friend came in one day to visit a retired bishop who was in a home for terminal cancer patients. How are you doing, he asked. The bishop replied, I'm just sitting here letting God love me. Why not do the same as you grieve? Just sit there in God's presence and let God love you as you grieve. Is he not closer to you than the air you breathe? And who loves you more than God? And do you not belong to him by right of creation, as well by right of redemption? Let God love you. Let God grieve with you. Hello, I am Sarah. We started a little late, so I'm going to skip some of the stuff, and I would just like to say if there's things you want to ask me or practical stuff you want to talk about, we're not going to really get into the weeds about like hosting a group and all the little details. A lot of that is in my book, and also we can talk about it more. But just so you have a sense of who I am, here I am, with Father Peter Baptist and Father Theophan Whitfield at my DMin. That's my husband and son Raphael, and there's our scrappy nativity pageant at St. Mary, and so I just like to show that picture. I'm very involved. I always direct the nativity pageant. And so I'm a chaplain, a board-certified chaplain, and I also was the bereavement coordinator for many years for hospice. And so that's really kind of my background. I've been doing this for 20 years. This is my 20-year anniversary of endorsement by the church as a chaplain. And there I am during the pandemic, and there I am with my palliative care team. I just want to give a little perspective. So I went to a conference just in terms of chaplaincy and how we've grown. This was in 2006. This was a chaplaincy meeting. I'm the one in the gray jacket, if you were wondering. So this was like a meeting I went to in 2006, and here we are in 2018. Look at all those chaplains. And so it's been a real blessing to see this grow. And a lot of chaplaincy overlaps with bereavement work. And oftentimes in hospices, the chaplain also kind of coordinates the bereavement work too. So there's a lot of overlap. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about a theological and liturgical perspective on grief and bereavement. And can you all hear me okay? Am I projecting enough? Okay, that's my theater background. What makes Orthodox grief unique and interesting? We'll talk a little bit, an overview about the group. What we're really going to talk about is there's an 8-week bereavement curriculum that I wrote at the end of the book. And the reason I did this is because there really wasn't anything like that existing. And over the years, Father Adrian Boudica and I have this podcast for Ancient Faith, and people would write to us and be like, what are your Orthodox grief resources? And I was like, we don't have a lot. We have like one lovely pamphlet. And so, not that mine is the final word, because it's definitely not, but it's sort of one of the many ways that I think we can start supporting each other, because our faith has a unique perspective on death and grief. It's not the same as other traditions, and there's a richness that we really need people to understand, because it's very healing. So briefly, I'll just say one thing. At the end of the day, in the midst of all this grief, in the midst of the pandemic, and these times when things are just really kind of challenging times, what we need to remember is that God is with us. And my short story about chaplaincy that really reminds us about the centrality of the cross. The cross is central to our understanding of grief, right? 22 years ago or more, I was doing my first on-call overnight as a chaplain. And one of my learning goals, you set learning goals in CPE, was, can I be an Orthodox Christian chaplain? Like, what does that mean? Is it a thing? I don't even know what this means. And most of my patients are not Orthodox. So, and some of you have heard this story, so forgive me, but it's a good one. So I got a page at like 4:30 in the morning overnight. Can you go please see a patient who's anxious before his surgery that's at 6 a.m.? They said he's Jewish. I say, okay, I get all dressed. I go visit the patient. He's intubated, cannot speak. Looks very sad, tearful eyes, super anxious, beard. And so I look at him, I say, hi, John. This is, again, my first on call ever. I'm tired and I'm sort of like excited and I don't know what to do. And I say, I'm the chaplain and I understand you're feeling nervous about your surgery. I understand you're Jewish. The nurses said you were Jewish so I could get a rabbi for you. And he shakes his head and he goes, oh. And I was like, you're Orthodox. So am I. So I'm sure he was just like, who is this crazy lady? But this was like the answer to my question of like, is there a space for this? Yes. And I knew him in making the sign of the cross. He didn't have to speak. He didn't have to do anything. He couldn't speak. But he could sign the cross in the very Orthodox way. And so anyways, for me, it's like, that's what I think about when I think about grief and joy, is like making the sign of the cross together. So we're not going to have time to talk about this more, but one thing that's very important, of course, when we care for anyone who's grieving is to have awareness of our own losses. Okay, we could say a lot about that, but just for now, that's a key point. Additionally, I also understand and just want to name that this is not theoretical for many of us. Okay, we are grieving. I don't know who is grieving right now, but I'm sure everyone is grieving in different ways right now. So again, to name that, I know these are not just thoughts, but again, this is our lived experience. So just to kind of, let's call into mind those who are grieving and those we're thinking about. Okay, as we've talked a lot about, Matthew 25 gospel, I was sick, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked. Suffering and healing occur in the body of Christ. It's that reciprocity, encountering Christ and being the presence of Christ for others. And so anything that we do therapeutically needs to be centered in the life of the church. It's centered in the life of the church. It involves willingness to connect with an open heart, a willingness to be uncomfortable sometimes, and to learn from others. And all of us are called to do this in different ways, which is really the OCAMPR key message. There are varieties of gifts, and it is the same spirit. And we are encouraged to do this wherever we are, and to bloom where we're planted. So, we're just going to throw it out there. Why is it so hard to talk about grief? Feel free to shout it out. As a culture, as individuals, as families, why is grief so, ugh? Yeah.
I think as Americans, we're taught always to handle everything and be like, I'm cool, I just lost my father, but I'm going to show up for work in the morning.
Right.
And people are like, that's a good answer.
Okay. We handle it, we show up, we move on.
It's vulnerable. If you talk about it, you might break down, and you don't want to.
I'm repeating it just for the microphone recording. Vulnerable, we might break down, we don't want to upset someone else if we talk about it. What else?
I think American society sanitizes the idea of death and loss and hides the realities of a lot of this by the processes that occur. And so people have lost the connection with this as a normal process, a process where you can have shared experience, have an understanding, have compassion, but also know that this is a normal part of existence. And so because of that, people have lost the language of grief and bereavement. They no longer know what to say to someone because it's so hidden in our culture. And so they say these really stupid things.
Right. We sanitize serious illness and death and grief. We don't know what to say. Yeah, Corinne?
I think we are afraid to suffer, and we avoid suffering and seek pleasure, comfort. So it's easier to say, oh, that's normal, things happen. Something worse can happens to others.
Right.
So
Avoidance, easier to seek other things, yes.
On the tails of what you were saying, I think we, and perhaps often rightfully so, are afraid of what other people say because it's not helpful.
Right.
And so we shut down and don't want to.
Right, you don't want to be vulnerable with others because you're aware they might say something that will hurt you even more. Okay. Right, also I think emotions, I think sometimes even as Christians, I can certainly think of other friends who of different Christian denominations who say, well, it's like, you know, they're with God. Like, so it's fine. Like,
Now they're an angel.
yay, or now they're an angel. It's like, no, that's not exactly right. So, or being afraid of emotions, you know, it's hard, you know, are we allowed to have emotions, right? Or instead, to be emotional is being vulnerable or something like that, or it's not, you know, we're resurrected people, you know, so I think we do ourselves an injustice when we're unwilling to talk about emotions, yeah.
I think that's really a key issue that's so different for Orthodox. I mean, we and our Bible reading friends forget that Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus and then promptly raised him from the dead, but he still wept.
Yeah.
It was horrible.
Absolutely. That was a very weird noise. Is it a mouse? Not me. I don't know what that was. Okay. So briefly, in the interest of time, I was just saying, what are the barriers to providing Orthodox grief support? So far, one thing I would say is we didn't have a lot of resources. Now we have one, and hopefully we'll get some more too. Also, I think just time, energy. The idea that the priests have to do all the work. No, we should be able to provide these ministries ourselves. So one thing that was really important to me when I thought through how to write this book was to make sure like anyone who's interested can facilitate this bereavement group. You know, you don't have to be a priest or even a therapist or have theological training to do it. And, you know, I always say, how can we provide better care for the grieving and why is it so needed now? I think in some ways now is a good time to talk more about grief because we all went through a pandemic and 1 million people died. And now suddenly everyone is a little bit more aware of it, you know, tragically. And so I think, you know, the time is now. Also, the Assembly of Bishops did this big needs assessment recently, the mental health ministries, and one of the main things that people were looking for was support groups and also grief support. So, with that said, is it okay to grieve? What does it mean to grieve with hope? We'll just do a little bit around like the theological and liturgical content of this, and then we'll talk about some of the more practical stuff. Okay, how do we view death, right? Death is a tragedy, and yet it is also a blessing from the Lord. Death is nonetheless Christ's gift and an expression of his mercy and compassion. So a Christian ending to our lives, painless, blameless, and peaceful, we pray for this, right? It's something to be prayed for. It's also something to fear, in the sense of with fear of God and faith and love draw near. We also, obviously, at Pascha sing, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. So we see, like Father Alexander Schmemann said, death, on one hand, is not natural, right? It's not originally part of the deal. It was not created by God as a natural event. It's a tragedy on the deepest level, for God created us not that we should die, but in order that we should live. And St. Paul characterizes death as an enemy. He must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. And this is different from, so on one hand, culture says, death is bad, we can't think about death. There's also this kind of like positive death movement, like death is part of life and it's natural and we should talk about it all the time and it's totally something we should embrace. And as Orthodox Christians, no, we're never black and white, right? It's always both. Yes, on one hand, it is unnatural. It's an enemy. It's something to be fought against. At the same time, it is part of life. And it's the way that we become fully human. It's the way that we are saved. So in one sense, it's a tragedy. In another sense, it's hope. It's the sense of our hope. It's what we hope for. And it's victory. So again, this is from the Liturgy of Death book by Father Alexander Schneemann that is really beautiful. So it's all these things at once, which makes sense, actually. And that's why we have kind of a complicated relationship with grief. Because it's tricky. And that's okay, because we have a lot to work with. We see grief in Scripture, as Dan just said. Jesus wept. See how he loved him. Weeping and lamenting is evidence of love. Obviously, Christ's followers stood vigil at the cross. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb crying, and then she saw the angels. So she was then tasked with sharing the news of the resurrection with the world, and also the death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentations over him. Okay, so we see this. Also, and again, I write a lot more about this, but we're just going to touch upon it briefly. There's my baby with Anne Bezaritas and Father Anthony, and now my son is none. But there are so many examples. We are incarnate beings. There's so many examples in liturgy of physical ways to understand how to grieve. So what that means is we lament, we cry out, think about the services during Holy Week. We pray, we name our sadness, we name our emotions. Liturgy shows us how to hold these things together at the same time, how to show up, right? How to stay present even when you are tired and you don't want to stand at church for 3 more hours, right? How to keep vigil at the foot of the cross. I mean, when I'm standing at the foot of the cross, to me it's like basically the exact same thing as standing at the bedside of a dying patient. The joke was like, don't you need to sit down? And I was like, no, I'm Orthodox. Like, I'm used to standing. But again, like that staying put, that standing, that waiting, all those pieces are part of accompanying the dying and accompanying the grieving. How to journey through pain and suffering, right? The only way out is through everything, through a Holy Week. And that Christ is in our midst. In the midst of this, we always know that God is present with us. So there's so many things in liturgy that we could talk more about. But for now, we'll talk about it after this. And again, we lament with the Mother of God. When you go to the lamentation service, I mean, we do not mince words, right? It's, oh, life, how can thou die? What? And so lamenting is not only like acceptable, we have to do it. Like we're supposed to do it as a body, as a church. And therefore, it gives us permission to do this in our own lives and to help other people lament as well. When I'm with a mother who's watching her son die, I think about the Theotokos. Like I think about these things. All of these things connect. Also, we can be brave in our grief. I feel like there's good vibes only, or like positive thoughts only, or positive thoughts and prayers. No, instead, our church allows us to experience the full range of all the emotions, and that's okay, in full color. And I love this quote from Rilke: "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." And I just feel like, we are called to be brave and to be honest and to learn how to cry in front of each other and to not be afraid of it. Okay. So what does it mean to grieve as others do who have no hope? From 1 Thessalonians. That's what Paul calls us to do. So to me, it doesn't mean just saying, well, they're with God and so therefore it's okay. And if I feel any other way, it's because I don't believe enough or something. No, instead, we are like the myrrh bearers, basically. And so what I mean by that is, what did the myrrh bearers do after Christ died? Well, they did what they knew what they were supposed to do, which is they went to anoint his body. That's the next thing that their life, the ritual life, that's what they knew they were supposed to do. Even though they probably didn't understand how Christ had died and why. They didn't know. They were in that in-between place. They went, with some agenda of anointing Christ, but also then were surprised and and then were tasked with the good news. And so for me, in Frozen 2, where, have you all seen Frozen 2? Okay, sorry. Spoiler alert, Olaf dies, doesn't really die.
Aww.
No, it's okay. And so, sorry, but so what happens is there's a song, there's this thing where Olaf, who's the snowman, he floats away and he dies. And Anna's there and she's so sad and she's crying. She's like, what do I do now? And the song is that you do the next right thing, right? What do you do in the face of grief? You do the next right thing. And so the Myrrh-bearers did the next right thing, right? They were like, well, we don't know what to do, so we'll do the thing that we know in community. And so in grief, we need to do the next right thing. And when you feel helpless or overwhelmed, prayer is very powerful. Just as a reminder, I have a million chaplain stories, and I won't share them all, but years ago, probably my first year as a chaplain, 2003 or 4, I was working in a hospice, and one of our colleagues, who worked in administration, her son had died by suicide. And understandably, she was devastated. And they said, could you support her and could you go provide care for her? Which is beautiful because chaplains really, we provide care for not only patients, but also staff. And I was really overwhelmed, truthfully, and I wasn't sure what to say to a mother whose son had taken his life. I didn't know what to do. So I listened and listened and listened, and she poured out her heart, and she talked about anger and grief and guilt and all these things and God and how could this happen. And I asked if she wanted me to pray with her. She didn't right then, but I said, I will keep you in my prayers. And I really tried to listen well, but I also felt very overwhelmed and helpless. And then, so I remember going to my car, and so I said, I'm going to pray for her. So I prayed for her fervently, I would say, and really just that she would gain some peace and, all the things we pray for. Okay. Then I saw her 3 weeks later, and I met with her in the hall, and she goes, Sarah, I can't thank you enough. You helped me so much. You said so many wonderful things. You gave me this new perspective and this and that and this, the other thing. And it was so humbling because I honestly had said 2 sentences. But I prayed for her, and I do think there was something in that was real, and it did provide her some comfort. So, when you're overwhelmed, still pray, because God can do that work for us. So, practical things. What's already out there in terms of grief support groups? So there are secular bereavement groups. Hospice programs always offer bereavement support groups to the public. Not only to hospice patients, to the families of their hospice patients, but also to the public, for free, even if you didn't use their hospice, which is good, although it tends to be sort of very secular and a mix of people. There's also Catholic archdiocesan groups, which are, again, available to the public, and I've known some Orthodox friends that used those groups, and again, they were fine, I would say. There's also a thing called Grief Share. Who's heard of Grief Share? Yeah. And Grief Share is a well-oiled machine, and there are lots of Grief Share groups. The thing about Grief Share, I did a very close reading of the text of Grief Share, and it's truly like an evangelical Protestant model, and it really has it's missing a lot of things that we would think are central to the life of the church. And also the theology and certainly the ecclesiology and the sense of sacramental life is not present in it. And there's a lot about personal relationship with God and grief and that kind of thing, which I just feel like it wouldn't quite resonate with an Orthodox Christian. And also I remember there's a line in it, it was the best thing about heaven, the best thing about going to heaven is that you get to meet Jesus there. And I was like, oof, this idea that finally you get to meet Jesus after you've died. And so not only is your loved one far away, Jesus is also very far away. They're over there and you're here. That is not an Orthodox way of thinking about Christ, right? We believe the kingdom is, however imperfectly present here. We can encounter Christ right now. So, anyways, I just think that was oof, it would just make you feel so not only is my loved one far away, but so is God. So I didn't love that.
Make an appointment.
Huh?
But you need to make a point.
Right, yeah, right, oof. Okay, so, here is these are the themes. So basically, the first part of my book is like all the theology and liturgy. The middle part, I did an IRB and I did qualitative research with 20 Orthodox Christians who were experiencing grief. All different demographics, all different relationships. And so I interviewed a ton of people and then I pulled out these themes and then wrote the curriculum based on those themes. So I have a lot of great stories in the middle of the book. To really, for me, that was about normalizing grief, bringing examples of what people think and feel in the midst of grief. And so here's kind of the themes. So 1 is lament, 2 is the healing found in prayer and liturgy, 3 is your community, 4 is memory eternal. What does that even mean? That was a very interesting question to ask people. Continuing bonds, which is a concept, a therapeutic concept kind of in bereavement care, holistic self-care, how grief can challenge our faith, and also bright sadness. And the things at the end, letter to self, pray, are activities that you can do in between each week. So 1 is like you write a letter to yourself about your own grief. 1 is about prayer life. 1 is about being intentional about connecting with others, creating a remembrance box, writing a letter to your loved one, and even sometimes writing a letter back to yourself from your loved one, which is very weirdly interesting sometimes and can be very therapeutic. Writing a self-care plan from like an Orthodox perspective, doing an act of kindness, and also say their names, which to me is, again, one of the many things that is beautiful about the faith, is we pray for the dead. We say their names. We say the names of those who we've lost, right? And that's something that we can do for other people who have lost loved ones, is we can be not afraid to name their loved ones, to talk about them. Okay. So again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty stuff right now, and I apologize if that's what you want to learn, but you can talk to me later about it. But basically, it's just you're a practicing Orthodox Christian. There's group guidelines. You can be a good listener. You have your blessing of your priest. And again, like have a heart that's open to the love of God and neighbor. It's been really cool to see some people reaching out to me like, oh, we're doing this group. Some people are doing them online. Some people are doing them at their parish. And like I have this vision at some point, hopefully soon, of finding a way to really offer the groups much more intentionally across our parishes and having a directory and doing some online groups, but really to really get this going, I think it would be so cool. Maybe to get a grant so then we can have some train the trainers and then people can go facilitate them in their community. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the themes and share some of our quotes that I got from people, and these are all pseudonyms. So these are all from Orthodox Christians. So Quinn said, "My dear friend's death was deeply distressing. Like I have a sense that when there are people in the world with you, you're okay, and when they're not there with you, it's a big loss. You have to readjust." Chris said, "Grief is so isolating. An immediate sense of unreality. I felt like Job." Leonard said, "My father's death was the worst thing that ever happened to me." And side note, Leonard he attended the funeral of his father when he was about 25, and until then he had never seen a dead body, and the first one was his father. He had never been to a funeral, and he was 25, because growing up, he hadn't really been encouraged to think and talk about this. So that's another thing to think about. How did our families, your families, did you talk about grief? Did you attend funerals? These things are all really important, right, as we go forward to try to care for others. So secondly, we talk about healing in prayer and memorials. So one thing that's so amazing is we have these memorials. So 3 days, 9 days, 40 days, every year. Again, the church teaches us that we should revisit our grief, right? It's not like you have a year and then you just go on and you never think about it again. Because clearly it's always there. So this way you have like permission from the church not only to think about the person, but to pray about them in the liturgical context. Again, that is really cool about the Orthodox Church. Yes?
Sarah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's one question I have for you today. when I am dealing with patients who are well past, I say the 40 days, and their depression is getting worse. I try to use the 40 days as a script from the church to say, God is giving you permission to come back into life again, to have life. And that the church has blessed this period of time for you to mourn, but you need to come back now. My concern is that they dive into these serious deep depressions, and 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, they have never let go, and they are deep in depression.
Right.
So do you see that as a way of talking to people about giving them permission to stop the unhealthy grief?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and actually I don't know if that quote's in here, but it's in the book where someone said the same thing, was like, after you have 40 days where you get to just flop around your house, you know, and really like be in the depths. And then as a church, you kind of come back, you're part of the church can support you. But it's true, sometimes that transition doesn't happen, and if anything, those month 3, month 4, month 5 are the worst months of grief, and there isn't that support. And so yes, I hear that, and combination of having therapy, maybe going to a group at that point is really a way to kind of transition like out of that memorial, but not to have this like very deep grief that's like
never ending.
Yeah, never ending, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, Ari. I wanted to ask, there's a therapist who supervised me for a while who always says, sadness is the cure for depression. Kind of like, okay, if you don't process your sadness, it stays within you and you become depressed. But obviously it's more complicated than that, right? Because if you're from like a close family system, Greek, for example, or anybody who's Orthodox, for example, it could be much worse than for someone who isn't close to their family, right? So do you have any like phrases you like to use?
So I think part of it is, again, the value of lament, expressing your sadness, being able to cry, being able to not be buttoned up and act like everything is fine. So not only in church, but also with one another. I think I have a lot of sort of like tricks that you can do to kind of get yourself to grieve, right? Because some people it's like so bottled up you can't even access it. So it's like, watch a sad movie that makes you cry for any reason and then get those tears going. Or, pick a theme song or a song that really makes you cry because it reminds you of your mom, and like play it every day and sit and be a mess. I think sadness is a big piece of it. Unexpressed sadness that doesn't come out can certainly contribute to depression. But I think we have to be, it's important to understand that like grief doesn't have to turn into depression. Obviously they overlap. But a real period of grief shouldn't be misunderstood as depression. But if it lingers on in different ways, we also want to think about the other factors that would make, and so, yeah. Oh, yes.
I was wondering, I've seen many times, and in myself as well, that sometimes you have a loss and someone dies suddenly and it triggers you to a sadness within you. Do you see that as well? It's like you're grieving a person, but you're also grieving something else in your life that has not been worked through yet.
Definitely, yes, I see that all the time. And so there's a lot of, right, so you experience one loss and then it brings back all your previous losses, or you're caring for someone and they've had a loss and then it reminds you of your loss, so there's all these pieces to it, yes, absolutely. And with many things, the key to it is just having the awareness that it's happening to you in the moment. It's not wrong when someone, if someone loses their mother and then it reminds you of your own loss, that's not wrong, that's human, it's actually good. But to be aware of it and to not let that then to completely shape the way you respond to the other person.
Right.
To have that boundary, to have that empathy and connection, but also to understand what's my pain and what's your pain. Yes.
I want to just take a second.
Yeah.
One of the people in my grief group was coming up on the 1 year now for her husband. They were both in their 50s. They married late, and he tragically died. And it was rough. And she just wrote this out to everyone, inviting them to the 1 year memorial. And what she wrote is, when people say that if you can get through the first year, you'll be okay, that time heals all wounds. I've heard it all.
what I can say is that it doesn't get any easier or that I miss him any less. I have just adjusted to my new life and I keep on going. What choice do I have, really? I heard a quote the other day saying that the best way to honor the lives we lost is to keep on living and to keep on loving. So to honor him, we will be doing the 1-year memorial at 10 o'clock at this church, and I'd love you all to be there and spend time together. I wouldn't be where I am right now without you by my side this past year. I love you, and I'm so grateful for all your loving towards. She said that to her whole friends group. So I mean, it's the kind of thing. It doesn't go away.
Right.
It's just it's part of who we are, but it's part of how we are moving forward also. And I was really, really pleased to see this because I felt like, she's not in denial of her loss, but she's also not, shackled by it.
Right.
And that's that healthy balance, I think you're talking about a little bit.
Absolutely. And there's, obviously the funeral, we could talk for hours about the funeral, but just looking at the text of the funeral and the tone of the funeral is so, give yourself some time to read the funeral text sometime. It is truly, it covers everything, right? Again, we don't mince words. I have to include this. My friend Anna, she said, I never wanted my husband's funeral to end. It was the most beautiful liturgy, it gave me more time with him. And I'm like, oh, that's amazing. But gave her more time with him, to pray with him, and it was really beautiful.
This was one of our best sessions. The idea that the person who's passed on is actively present and part of that, Bright Saturday Matins or whatever, that was
it's totally
wholly life-changing about how important it is and how beautiful it is, how everything you do in that reflects the church's true belief that that person is present there praying with you in the name. And it's very powerful.
Couldn't say it better. Yeah.
A friend of ours who was visiting the monastery where Father Roman Braga was a spiritual father, he came at the time of the funeral, and the abbess said, well, why don't you go and greet Father Roman? He was in his casket.
Right. Yeah. Right. And again, that's something that's very unique, and so it affects the way we think about death, and personhood, and who the person is, and our relationship with them. And so that's, these and many other things are a very particularly Orthodox way of thinking about it. And so when you go to a group where they're like, well, the funeral's only for the, it's only for the living. It's not for the dead. No, it's for both. It's for both. And that's really important to remember, right? Okay, so chapter 3 is about your community, kind of how people around you respond, which in the best and worst ways, we've all had people say crazy things to us in grief and beautiful things. Like Priscilla at the bottom, she said, everyone kept saying my mom had a long life. It's true, but she was 97, but she's still her mom, right? And so it was still hard, right? Leonard said, everyone kept saying I seemed fine, and it was like I was comforting them, but ultimately he thinks he was kind of in shock, and he was like not even present, because he couldn't even comprehend everything.
It's crazy.
It is good.
And one person said to me the craziest thing they ever heard was when someone said, I totally understand what you're going through because I lost my pet ferret.
Okay.
I wasn't healed until I just went out and bought another one.
Right.
It was like some
parallel works, right?
From this.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sarah, I don't know if you came across, I don't know if this is a universal, but in my own personal experience of Orthodox funeral, thinking of my own father's funeral, one of the moments which sort of catches your attention, though, is, at least in his case, the priest put the lid on the coffin and then nailed it at the end.
Well,
and there was a finality there that was a landmark moment.
Right, I believe that, yeah.
Before the 40 days.
Right. Thank you. And I think, one thing that was interesting in writing this book too is we pray, may their memory be eternal. We say this all the time. But what does it mean, right? Like, and so I asked people, what does memory eternal mean to you? So it was a little bit all over the place. But Sasha, I would say, kind of gets to it. By praying memory eternal, does that mean he will be in paradise? Let's say I remember my grandparents, my nephew and niece will remember me, but who is going to remember 3 generations more? It's not eternal if it's limited to our lifetime. No, I guess I take it personally to remember him at the memorials, and I also know that matters of this world are temporary. So what then? God remembers, right? And so memory eternal is really God's memory of us, God's memory of God's children, and which is made sort of continually alive in our remembrance, in our participation. Briefly, okay, so we're getting there, but long story short, there's this interesting concept called continuing bonds in the bereavement world, which is basically, this concept that you remain in relationship with your loved one after they have died. Instead of kind of this medical model of being like 1 year and then you just sort of like get over it. Instead, you have this changing relationship with the deceased person. Newsflash, not really a new concept. So continuing bonds are part of our life in the church, right? So this is it's like a super OCAMPR moment, right? Where you're like, continuing bonds of the secular world is actually totally something that's already part of the life of the church. We pray for the dead. We ask them to intercede for us. We see them in dreams or visions. We have icon corners. We have pictures of them. We name our babies after our family members. Again, and we in memorializing them and naming them, we're in communion with them in the life of the church. I have all these interesting stories of people who had like visions and dreams, which is another way that people stay connected. And again, that's cool. Like dreams can be very meaningful, right? We don't take them all literally all the time, but certainly in the life of faith, we understand that dreams can be a very powerful way to deepen our understanding of our faith or our relationship with our loved ones. So, this woman shared how she saw like visions of her mother and her grandmother. She said, "We'll be together soon, but not too soon, though." So I have a section on self-care, which again and I talk a little bit about complicated relationships, because the thing about grief is oftentimes we have a pretty loving relationship with someone who died. A lot of other times we have very complicated relationships with them. So sometimes, the person, we have a traumatic relationship with them. Maybe they were abusive. Maybe we were estranged. Maybe we failed them or they failed us. There's a lot of complexity there. But again, I think we can hold that and we can talk about that and explore it in a way that doesn't destroy the relationship, but instead is actually very real. And there's still even room to grow in your relationship with your loved one even after they have died. Francine said she had a tricky relationship with her mom, and she said, "I'm still trying to work out my relationship with her. Forget the craziness, I feel her and that she's here and alive. My grief was tied into the finality of not figuring out our relationship, not quite fixing everything." She said, "But I came to see the good side of her." And so for her, actually kind of having this prayerful ongoing relationship with her mom was actually healing in her grief. And, and having those times to really pray again about it and to reform her relationship and her understanding of who her mom was to her. Self-care domains, not just bubble baths with a glass of wine. So, I have a little kind of a checklist where you can go through stuff, right? So it's faith, there's aspects of our faith practice, there's health aspects, exercise, sleeping, eating, there's social life, friends, fun activities, hobbies, emotional, psychological, therapy, reflection. Are we having depression? Are we having anxiety? But just kind of to go through and look at all these pieces, right? And it's not just about me, right? Christ is in the center of that. And then we kind of take stock of all these aspects of our life. And we might find that 3 of them are going great and 1 is very bad. And so that will give us a little time to kind of focus more on that. Also, the next one is about how grief can challenge our faith. So again, I prayed so hard for my grandfather not to die. Now I see that when you pray, sometimes God says yes, sometimes no, and sometimes I have something better for you. And then another person said to me, you know, for her, it really deepened her faith. It deepened her sense of the love of God, the overseeing of God. She said, I'm approaching the no green bananas stage, which means you might not have time for the bananas to ripen before you die. Yeah, so I'm approaching the no green banana stage, which I had never heard of that, but I thought it was kind of brilliant. And finally, again, bright sadness. This concept that we can be sad, we can mourn, but we always have hope. You know, this woman said, the thing is, the Orthodox believe differently than a lot of people. My friend at work lost his son, and he just keeps saying, I don't believe in God now. What kind of a God would do this to me? And I just have to say to him, we don't understand this. It's a mystery. We live in a fallen world. Jesus came. Jesus himself died to abolish death. We are healed in death. Imagine if we were here and Jesus never came. I can't imagine. But it was just like this sort of beautiful way of expressing it, that for her, yes, it is a mystery. Yes, we live in a fallen world. And Christ trampled down death by death. And finally, just in terms of the last theme, Anna said she wore all white to her husband's funeral. And when everyone kept saying, I'm sorry, she replied over and over again with Christ is risen. That's all you need to say. So that's what I did when my husband died. I wore a white dress and I said, Christ is risen. So I have a little bit about, in the interest, I have like 1 minute left. Okay, I'm just going to whip through this stuff. Okay, religious platitudes. We don't need them. Everything happens for a reason. You have a new angel in heaven. God only takes the most special people. God needed her more than you do. Only the good die young. Good song, not good concept. At least he went quickly, and now he's finally with God. We don't need those things. We can go beyond that stuff, right? And I get it. People say it because they're trying to be nice, and they're trying their best, and they don't know what to do. But we can improve this. We'll just say, having beheld the resurrection of Christ, let us worship the Holy Lord Jesus, the only sinless one. We venerate your cross, O Christ, and we praise and glorify your holy resurrection. For you are our God, and we know no other than you. We call on your name. O come, all ye faithful. Let us venerate Christ's holy resurrection. For behold, through the cross, joy has come into all the world. Through the cross, joy has come into the world. Let us ever bless the Lord, praising his resurrection. For by enduring the cross for us, he has destroyed death by death. That is what you should say to someone. And I have a handy list of what not to say, and then what to say. Which is funny because to me in some ways it was the easiest thing to write, and people were like, this is such a great list. But so these are all the things that we don't want to say to people, and then these are the things that we do want to say. I care about you. I don't know what you're going through. I love you. I think your mom is such a great person. You look just like your dad. Tell me what you miss about so and so. What would you like? Do you want me to come bring you food on Thursday? Right? That's what we need. We need that practical stuff. And so finally, always remember, God is with us. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. I love that psalm verse. The simple act of listening quietly can facilitate healing. You are not alone. Contact your priest. Email me. I'll help you work on setting up a group if you want. And we're all connected in Christ. So here's our resources that we have, and I look forward to talking with you more. Thanks.
Lunches technically start till 12:30, so we've
Oh,
got
it
a
is?
couple minutes.
Well, for some reason I
there's
thought-
a 15-minute gap
Okay.
between session and
Oh,
lunch.
that's right.
So
Okay.
maybe if there's
So if there's any
little
questions, yes.
Burials, can you say something about alternatives to the burial industrial complex?
Yes. Yes. So there is a great book, as many of you probably know, called A Christian Ending by Deacon Mark Barna.
Yeah.
And I think it's an Ancient Faith book maybe, or it's Google it. Christian Ending. And it's about basically their church has a sort of natural burial process and they really talk through the details of it and the legal pieces and the practical stuff. I don't have a lot of experience with that. Has anyone been part of that? Yeah, do you wanna say anything about it?
So we just did one last year, and I navigated all of the legal stuff for New Hampshire.
So what we're talking about is actually not embalming the person.
Right,
Like it's a quick,
green
fast,
burial
green
or-
burial where within a short period of time, and there's ways to care for the body, there's ways to navigate kind of the legal, technical things, which are like state laws and that kind of thing, so.
Yeah, I mean, the Barnes have amazing resources, so I would absolutely say, go to, find their book, what they've put out. I know the OCA posts some of their resources on their website. Varies state by state, some are more open and aware, some are more restrictive, but there's always things you can do. And there's hybrids. The experience that I had was absolutely beautiful. We were able to deliver the body from the hospital to the family's home. The family was there, they were praying, we all anointed the body. It was the most transformative experience. And even when we couldn't get away from a vault, you can flip the vault and still place the body in the ground, contact with the earth. There are ways you can do it and there are resources available, for sure.
Seems like this is something that should be discussed among the hierarchs.
Yeah.
Much more traditional.
Maybe we can
This
have
is
them
done
come
in
to
pockets and we're all
OCAMPR.
We
sharing.
started
Come to
giving,
OCAMPR.
we started
use
giving
dry
workshops,
ice at our
actually.
monastery.
Yeah, there's all these.
In Riverside, California, the church has a ministry for this. They have men that have been trained and they work with the deceased men and women that work with, to prepare the bodies. They actually have a place in the church where they can do all that. They have the funeral and then off to. If you don't have your own cemetery, you can't avoid the cost of someone digging the grave and filling the grave, and you end up paying those things. But it's a beautiful ministry. There's people that have just decided to be trained to be able to do that, and then it reduces the cost fairly significantly.
Oh my gosh.
It's a challenge though, because the European Union has invaded a practice that has been going on for centuries in Romania, where they would lay the person out in the home and they would keep vigil and read the Psalms up until the moment of the funeral.
Right.
And now the newer churches have to have like a little what would have been the crypt, below the crypt, or in the crypt area, they have a cold room, and it's very hard for the grieving families who knew the older tradition.
But like think
because
about.
they thought there was massive chances of an epidemic, which
Right.
never occurred.
Right.
And this
I mean,
is
but it's
the
like, again,
bureaucrat.
connection of liturgy and life. Like, we keep vigil at the cross. We stay up all night reading the Psalms. It's exactly the same thing that we should be doing for our loved ones. It's like, we know how to do this, but yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
How do you deal with, like, I mean, I guess we're talking about in an Orthodox context, but how does it look like when you can't say a lot of these things, for example, with a parent who's no longer of the faith, or they were, like, maybe you're a convert and your parents, I mean, my parents became Orthodox, but there's several of my siblings who are not.
Right.
And so, like, that fear, like, as a chaplain, even with Christian patients, like, they're afraid that their loved one isn't saved.
Right. Yeah.
And, like, dealing with that
Yeah.
kind of grief because it's not resolved in a sense. Or it's hard for it to be resolved because you don't know what their spiritual state was like.
Right. I mean, I think, it was interesting because the people I interviewed several people who were converts and some who were like cradle. And then I also interviewed people whose loved ones were Orthodox and whose loved ones were not Orthodox. And it was interesting because what I did find is certainly in terms of our own coping, being Orthodox, even if our loved ones are not, there is still like a real depth in participating in a community that can support you in your grief. And certainly we can pray a memorial for a loved one who's not Orthodox, right? Yeah. I mean, and you can, I mean, maybe not the full funeral, but certainly we can do memorials. We can name our loved ones in memorials. So there's places where we can kind of bring them into the life of the church, even if they're not participating in it. I can see that, though. I mean, there's definitely a lot of differences. There's a lot of differences in terms of our understanding of salvation or our understanding of their relationship with God, and some of that anxiety and fear. It can be really hard to navigate. I mean, I'm the only Orthodox person in my family. My whole family is Presbyterian and Roman Catholic and Jewish. So my funeral, they're going to be like, what is happening? So because they will.
Why is everyone wearing white?
Right. Why is everything Christ is risen? Why is she right there? And so I think, I don't know. So I think that's hard to navigate. But I think it's something, again, just to talk about it, to be aware of it, to find places where we can talk openly about what we believe, and then when appropriate to convey that to people. But again, like I hear that, we live in a pluralistic society where not everyone has the same beliefs, but there are ways to incorporate it, I think, authentically as much as we can. Or like people who come to a funeral who aren't Orthodox, and then they get there and they're like, what is going on, right?
Yeah, one of these funerals we were at our monastery, and it involved a large extended family who had never been in an Orthodox service of any kind.
Right.
And you could hear a loud stage whisper in the back, if they say, Lord have mercy one more time, I'm gonna scream.
Right? You're like, well, buckle up, because it's gonna happen.
It's interesting with the memory eternal piece too, because I do that with my patient. I just naturally do it. Like I always cross myself. I can't stop myself even if I wanted to. But I always tell patients, like we say in my tradition, may that memory be eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the look on their face is like they I've never ever gotten a complaint about saying that. Or about,
because it's beautiful.
Yeah, I know. But the CPE instructor is always scary.
Right. No,
it's
true. No, I hear that.
Yeah, they're just like she will be, and then I'll say like, and may you live on her memory, like in your lives, and people will know who she was by who you are.
Yeah.
And that tends to be very therapeutic for them. That idea of not only can I remember her and her death, or this patient and their death, but I also can live their memory on by the way I live my life.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yon?
How would you sit with or counsel a teenager whose friend or classmate has killed himself? As for someone like a teenager who's emotionally less.
I don't think I can give a 1 minute answer to that question. But no, I mean, certainly, it's awful. I mean, we grieve for anyone, and I mean, I think first of all to provide a kind, safe space to be honest and to talk about it, to let them know that to connect them with any resources, peer support, therapy, all those kinds of things, to talk about the underlying issues. Also, just to encourage people to have compassion, to think of when we think about someone who has died by suicide, we may all know someone. And many of us, I write this about in the beginning of the book, I had a lot of losses when I was in high school. My gymnastics team, I was like co-captain of our gymnastics team. We lost 2 of our gymnasts. One died in a car accident and one died by suicide. And the one who died by suicide was like the most cheerful, happy-go-lucky, dimply, amazing. I mean, she was amazing. We were all devastated. And I was 17. It's like, what do I even know about any of this? And so I think, like anything in the face of a tragedy, to provide a safe space to talk about it, to not talk about it only once, but to talk about it many times, to demystify some of the pain and the suffering and trauma that people are experiencing privately, to really talk more openly about it, and to pray for them, to say we can always pray for our loved ones, right? We can always pray for them. And there's some things that we don't understand, but and again, that God is with us. I mean, I think I sort of default to that all the time.
And they're Orthodox prayers.
There's exactly, yeah.
That are available for praying for the suicide victim. And personally experiencing that it's extraordinary, because the prayer puts you into their position in a sense. Yeah. And you're not, it's not like they're over there damned, but you're there with them.
Right.
And it's sometimes helpful to kind of go through the long liturgical process of our prayers rather than just, and by the way.
Absolutely. I love that about our funeral too, like the perspective taking. Like we sing and there's like the voice of the priest praying on our behalf, and then there's the voice of the choir singing back, there's the prayers of the people, but then we actually hear the voice of the person who has died. Like there's all these different voices, right? So we sort of assume we're not just like praying about the person, but instead we are all praying together with the person. Anyways, many richnesses. So, I think we have to get going in a minute,
Time to
otherwise,
go.
yeah, so we'll talk more after. Thank you.